Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And today we are revisiting Late Night with the Devil. Now, I actually didn't do a review of this when this film came out back in March or April, I think, of this year. I had actually seen it prior to its release on streaming. I was able to catch a screening of it when it premiered at the 2023 South by Southwest Film Festival. I did give an initial reaction to it when I talked about all the horror films that I saw at South by that year. I'll leave a link somewhere up here where you can click on it and see my initial review if you're interested. And then I did say earlier this year that this would be a film that I would probably revisit around this time in October, just because it's a Halloween movie, right? Now is like the perfect time to sit down and revisit it. I always thought it was a little weird that Shudder wanted to release it in the spring, but I'm sure they had their reasons. And before we get into my thoughts and analysis on this film, I will just say this video is going to contain spoilers. I will be giving spoilers for the whole film. So if you haven't seen the film yet, you don't want to be spoiled, this is not the video for you. Come back after you've seen the movie. And so I finally went back and revisited it and thought I would come on here and just share my thoughts, having gone back to it and, you know, considering some of the controversy around this movie, especially with the use of AI. I'll give my opinions on that towards the end of the video. When I first saw this film at South by Southwest, my initial reaction was that I really loved it. I really liked it a lot. It was definitely one of my favorites that I saw in the entire festival. And it was funny because I remember when I went to go see it, it was like a super early morning screening. I think it was like an 8:30 a.m. or like a 9 a.m. screening. And I had been out late the previous night because that's what you do when you're at film festivals. And so I remember it being a very like groggy morning and just coming into this like small little theater in Austin. It pulled me in like immediately, and I think a lot of that does have to do with the aesthetics of it. I've said in previous videos, you know, I am a sucker for like that kind of old time 70s 80s aesthetic, especially when it is done well. And I felt like for the most part the visuals in this film did match up with that 70s aesthetic. I really loved the whole talk show environment. I thought that was a pretty interesting location. From a filmmaking perspective, it's really smart because everything is being like contained in one location. This is obviously a low budget film, and you can definitely tell from the 2 minutes of production company logos that start this thing. When I saw this at South by, we did not have all those logos. It just went straight into the movie. So rewatching it on Shudder and just like seeing, I mean, it had to be like what, like 9 or 10 different film production logos. And I'm sure that each of these companies, you know, had a hand in some aspect of this film, but I did have to laugh at just the 2 minutes of production company logos. Anyway, so again, really loved the aesthetics of it, really loved the look at it. You know, I really loved a lot of the characters in this film as well. David, I always butcher his last name. How do you say his last name? Dashmalichin? I know I just like butchered that, but I love David in this movie. I think he is so charming and he fits this role so well as like the late night talk show host. He's the one that really makes this movie what it is. I do like the other characters as well. I really enjoy Christu and Carmichael. Like, they do genuinely feel like these odd characters that you would see on a late night program. And I love Gus. Poor Gus. He was just the sweet innocent party in all of this. I know that one of the criticisms of this movie is that it's presenting itself as a found footage film, right? Like in the beginning, it's saying this is a lost broadcast from this late night TV show. So it's presenting itself as a typical found footage movie, right? The whole like lost media idea. And I know that some people get frustrated because it's setting itself up to be that way, but then it's like not really a found footage movie. And you can tell that the stuff happening behind the scenes is very clearly like your standard typical way of filming a narrative movie. It doesn't really have that like found footage feel to it. None of the characters are reacting to the fact that there's a camera behind the scenes filming them. Like, you would think, given some of the conversations that they're having in this movie, especially around people dying and just the whole talk about like ratings and the studio, like you would think if they knew they were being filmed, that's something that they wouldn't like talk about. So that part of it, like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense from a found footage standpoint. I will say on my rewatch of the film, that didn't bother me. Like, it didn't bother me the first time that I saw it, and it didn't bother me the second time either. Only because, you know, watching it the second time, I was like, yes, it does have these found footage elements to it, but there is something about it that doesn't feel like a traditional found footage movie, especially in the way that it starts, right? It starts off with this shot in the studio, and there's this old TV there, and the camera is like zooming into the TV, and then it's like starting up this documentary. But even that like doesn't feel like what you would expect of a typical found footage movie. To me, that just signaled that like this wasn't really meant to be found footage. You know, because I guess I was like, well, is this really supposed to be like lost media that's found, or are we in just some other kind of like weird dimension and just seeing like the events that happened this night? I'm saying that because at the end it seems to be doing this whole weird like shifting of dimensions, or at least of different perspectives. It kind of takes us down like this weird place, and so I'm just wondering if the beginning of the film is also taking place in this kind of weird otherworldly space. And I get that people that are coming into this and expecting something in the same vein as like Ghost Watch, or even like the WNUF Halloween special. Those are films that are doing very similar things, but they're at least committing to they're committing to the aesthetic of actually being this like live broadcast. So I can see why someone coming into this movie expecting that and then not getting it would be disappointed or maybe kind of annoyed. But I will say, just taking Late Night with the Devil for what it is and what it is presenting, like, I do enjoy it. And I think, you know, the first thing that really stood out to me is the way that this film is playing with that perception. Like the ending and just how it opens the film up. Like literally it goes into like this widescreen, and it feels very like modern day filmmaking versus the 70s aesthetic. I remember seeing that for the first time in the theater, and honestly, like, that freaked me out the most. And I know that some people are not a fan of the ending or where the film goes, but I just remember sitting in the theater because I was like, what in the world is this movie doing? So I like that. I do think it was creative in the way that, yes, it's setting itself up to be a found footage film, and then just like completely deconstructing all of that and completely bending the rules. At least for me, there is something about that feels eerie. Right, like you're going into it expecting to know what the formula is going to be, and then when it like twists the formula and plays with it in this really like interesting way, for me, like, I found that very unsettling. And I do think the way that it is questioning perception and everything that we're seeing adds a really interesting thematic element to the film. Like, one thing that really stood out to me rewatching it again, there's this running theme that the characters keep bringing up of like, okay, we're recording this segment with this possessed girl, and we're going to talk to the devil through her, and the camera is going to capture it all, and that's going to be our evidence that this is real. There's this running belief amongst many of the characters that the camera captures reality, right? That the camera is the bringer of truth, I guess.
You don't think the television cameras lie, do you, Mr. Haig?
No, of course not.
Which is something that's really interesting to think about in this day and age, where we know that that's not always true. I've mentioned this in so many like videos, but it is interesting that we keep seeing this theme coming up in these modern day horror films around this idea of like, what is reality? Not to say that cameras can't capture the truth, and we also live in a time where images and media can be doctored. Just because something was filmed with a lens, that does not necessarily mean that what we are seeing is an actual representation of whatever event the camera recorded. And I think the film does point this out at various parts. Again, you have like the character of Jack, who is saying, okay, everything that our camera captures is real. But then if you remember from the beginning of the film, when it's doing that like documentary and talking about the Night Owl TV show, the narrator of that documentary says that because ratings were going down, the producers of the show and Delroy were having to figure out what they could do to get ratings up. And so they were manufacturing these very audacious segments.
Jack and his longtime producer, Leo Fisk,
go out of their way to court controversy in a bid to improve audience share.
So already in the beginning of the film, it's telling you like things are being manufactured by this TV show and being presented as real in order to try to get more eyeballs on the show. So I do like that the film is always playing with this idea around like what is actually truth here, and the reason why some of this manufacturing is going on with some of these characters. And when I say manufacturing, I don't just mean that in like the stunts that they're doing. I think what we're seeing here is like a group of characters that are also, you know, manufacturing themselves, that are also putting on this performance, especially with characters like Carmichael, who I know people like criticize his character as being very over the top and theatrical, and I definitely thought that too rewatching the film. I was like, okay, this guy is like clearly a theater actor, but it also makes sense for the type of persona that he's portraying. He's also an entertainer in his own right, and so of course he's gonna come on here and have this like larger than life personality and be very like flamboyant and like, oh, look at me. And that connects to this other running theme that I saw in the film, which is just this idea of letting fame and money and greed overtake you. And to me, rewatching this film, and again, this is just my interpretation of the story. Yes, obviously we do get a lot of, you know, devil worship, and there's the whole thing with like the cult. Yes, within the context of the film, it does seem like those things are real, but I do think there is this extra layer of it, this kind of layer underneath everything, that suggesting that, you know, the real demonic entity in this movie, the real evil, the real devil, if you will, is this like human greed and ego and just obsession with, again, power and money. One thing that I thought was interesting is that there are a few scenes where when the actual like devil is being brought up, it's usually followed with some comment about the advertisers of the show or the sponsors of the show. Like there's one moment where Jack turns to the camera and he says something along the lines of like, okay, and now we're gonna have a conversation with the devil, but right after a word from our advertisers.
As we attempt to commune with the devil, but not before a word from our sponsors.
So again, very much connecting this idea of like evil with greed, consumerism, wanting to be number one in the ratings. I know another thing that people will complain about this movie is that it's called like Night with the Devil, but we don't actually ever really see the devil. And you know who else we also don't see in this movie is the studio heads. The entities that Jack Delroy and his producers are probably more afraid of than the actual devil, at least, you know, the devil as they're thinking of it, which is probably the red guy with the horns and the tail. But they do make a point of saying that the heads of the studio are there. There's a moment behind the scenes where Jack is talking with the producer, and the producer says, oh, the studio heads are out in the audience, like, don't look at them.
Don't look now. Cavendish's new vice president of marketing and his wife are sitting in the front row with the head of airtime.
So we know that they're there, but we actually never see them as a viewer. I do find it fascinating that there's a link here in that, yes, the devil's being evoked, but we never see him. Also, the studio heads are being evoked, but we never see them either. But again, we just have these two like entities that are overshadowing this production. And I do think we can see a linkage here between the two. And again, this is just my interpretation of the film. And you know, I am not someone that is an expert in the Bible by any means, but I believe in the Bible there is mentions that one of the ways that the devil works, one of the ways that evil works, is through these very negative human traits. Again, this kind of going towards the darkness and going towards the greed and not caring about who you hurt in your quest for like ultimate power, right? I mean, isn't this where we get like the 7 deadly sins from? Think about it. You have Christu who just died on set, and the only thing that like Jack and his producers are worried about is like, okay, well, don't tell people because we can't have it ruin our show. And then once they find out that their ratings are through the roof, it's like the whole thing with like Christu never happened. Like they completely like disregard that and are just excited about having their ratings.
What did he say? Just that he thinks it's the biggest TV event since the moon landing. Who was I to disagree? We're back. Baby, back! We're back from the fucking dead.
What is that if not just like evil? Completely disregarding the life of this other person for your own ratings and your own game. So to me, that was like the real evil in the film. And I know for some people that's probably gonna be like, ugh, how pretentious. And it's not as fun as seeing like an actual demon. And this is certainly not the first film to explore the idea of, you know, the faults of human nature being manifested in some sort of demonic entity. And I would argue that a lot of the occult cinema from the 1970s that this film is pulling from, I do think the underlying through line for a lot of these movies is some sort of fault in human nature and allowing the darkness to come into one's life. And yeah, for me, like rethinking about it, yes, I do think, you know, Jack being part of the cult, like, yes, I do think he signed his soul over to the devil. For me, I feel like the moment where he really signed his soul over is that moment that we get at the beginning of that documentary where he's in the production offices with the studio heads and he's signing that 5-year contract to make the TV show, right? To me, that's where he's like selling himself over to evil, because that's the moment where it's like, okay, yes, now you're part of the talk show and now you have to keep the ratings up and you need to keep our advertisers happy and you need to keep our sponsors happy and you need to keep bringing that money in. And it's this pressure that then leads him to the predicament that he's in by the end of the film. And again, I think we see this with the other characters as well. I mean, you have the whole thing with like Lily and June coming in and being like, you know, I'm helping this girl, I'm the only one that's been by her side. But then at the same time, I think the film is also shining a light on the fact that it's like, okay, you say you want to help this girl, but also you're parading her around on live TV and using her to promote this book that you've written. And it seems like promotion of this book is something that you had in mind since you sent the manuscript to Jack in the first place, and that's what made him interested to have her on his show. And even in moments where Jack is pressuring her to let Lily let the demon out of her to speak, she's a little hesitant, but it also doesn't take that much to like convince her to do it either. And even Lily is like, oh yeah, come on, June, like we said, we wanted to get our message out to everyone.
But we want everyone to know the truth. Don't we, June?
Like, I think that's the other interesting piece about this. Convincing the masses of something, right? Using your fame and power to convince other people to believe in whatever it is that you're trying to peddle them. And again, I think this is where this idea around perception comes in. And we have a film here in which you have the studio audience, which is a very important part of the film, right? They are the ones that are bearing witness to all of this. We have a whole film in which you have this group of characters who, again, is trying to convince the audience of something, whether it's Jack just trying to desperately convince them to keep watching so he can keep his ratings up, or it's Carmichael who's trying to convince them to get on his side and believe him.
You said I used to be the best? Perhaps I still am. Now would be the appropriate time to applaud.
Or it's Lily and June that are trying to convince people that the devil is real and, oh, by the way, buy my book. There's something interesting here around like power and ego and this kind of wanting to be like number one. Like all of that can only sustain itself when it has an audience. And I think we see this in real life. You know, I've mentioned it before, but you can look at our political circus as evidence to this. You can look at people on social media, right? The way that people will put on these like acts and perform these very audacious ways in order to get those views, right? Because having views is where like the power and the money comes in. So I think having the studio audience being a part of this is actually a really important component to just the themes that the film is trying to explore. And I think the audience here can be both, yes, the studio audience, but also us as the viewers. And maybe that's why, you know, the film does take that weird turn at the end where it seems like we're going from viewing things in an objective point of view to being within the subjectivity of Jack, him experiencing everything that we saw at the beginning of the film, but experiencing it in, again, this very distorted, very hellish way that then leads to this like violent ending. And I think the film taking us on this more like subjective viewpoint is perhaps the filmmakers trying to get across this message, like, okay, this like quest for like, you know, whatever, fame, power. This is really what it leads to, right? This is like really what it like does to your brain. You get kind of stuck in this like hellish vortex, reality and non-reality, like you can't tell the difference anymore. And what I also find interesting, right, is that you have these three characters that are in the quest of, again, getting the audience on their side. And they are all characters that are either directly involved with the devil or some demonic entity, or at least linked to the devil within like their aesthetics. Like Carmichael, for example, like I found it really interesting that the film chose to dress him in that red velvet jacket, and he's even got like, you know, the whole like mustache, the twirling mustache. Like, his look feels very evocative of like a devil type character that we might see in like pop culture or movies. So again, I think linking this idea and this quest for like fame and power with the demonic. I understand why people don't like the ending. Watching it again, I did still find it pretty chilling, especially that part where everyone is dead around him and the camera's just like pulling back and he's just repeating that line, like the what is it, like, dreamer, you're awake.
Dreamer, you're awake.
Which is clearly him trying to convince himself that this is all a nightmare. But I think you could also even read it in this way of him being the dreamer, and he's now awake to everything that has happened, and he's now awake to what this path has actually led him to do. And he's now fully realizing that he's the cause of his wife's death. I also love too, like, when we're in the middle of this like frenzy and he goes up to the camera and he's like telling the audience, like, turn it off, turn it off.
Turn off your TV set. Stop watching this. Turn it off!
That felt very similar to what we get at the end of Halloween 3, Season of the Witch.
Turn it off. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it.
Which is another film that is using television and consumerism as ways of mediating this ancient evil to the masses. So that's my thoughts and analysis on what was going on with Late Night with the Devil. But I did like the way that it, you know, tightly wove everything together. I do like that it's more of a slow burn with a few like really creepy special effects scenes here and there. And I guess just to like conclude my thoughts on it and, you know, talking about the whole AI thing, there was controversy when this film came out because the filmmakers admitted to using artificial intelligence to create some of the artwork that we see in the film, right? The interstitials between the commercial breaks, the whole like, we'll be right back. I mean, I know they've backtracked since and have said like, oh, we hired artists to do that and it was the artist's choice to use AI. And that might be very well what happened. My thinking on it is that I obviously agree with a lot of the concern around AI and a lot of the concern around it being used for these creative means, whether it's writing something or artwork. And at the same time, I can also understand from an indie filmmaking standpoint, you know, making a film is not easy by any means, and if you're trying to do something on this scale, that does take time and money. When you're at this stage, all you're trying to do is like save time and money. So I could see, you know, wanting to use these tools that could help them either get some of that time or money back. Yes, I think in situations where you can afford to hire someone, you can afford to hire an actual artist to do your work, that's what you should be doing. And then if that artist chooses to use AI as part of their work, that's kind of like a moral thing for you as a filmmaker and working with your artist to like figure out. I think for something like this where it is so quick, for me personally, this is just a personal take on it, that's not enough to negate the other hard work that obviously went into this movie. There's a lot of really great work here from everyone that I don't think 3 seconds of AI can really take away. And again, I know other people feel differently about that. As us, as consumers of media, we're gonna have to make a choice whether or not we are going to support work that is AI generated or that uses AI in a more substantial way than, you know, I would argue this film did. And, you know, that certainly is a case that's happening. I think it was last week I saw Variety released an article talking about Meta and Blumhouse teaming up to play with these AI tools, and Blumhouse is getting some of their filmmakers to go over to Meta and try out this AI technology that I believe is helping in the creation of actual stories. These things are happening. Let's not deny that they're not. And so I think we as consumers of this medium, as fans of film, as fans of any kind of artwork, need to decide where we are going to stand on that, if we are going to support this kind of artwork or if we are not. And I think, you know, another step beyond that is also supporting people within institutions that can help make rules and regulations with AI technology and how far certain companies can take it. Everything in this video is just my own personal beliefs and thoughts. So if you think differently, like, I totally get it. You know, when I first heard that the film did use AI, even in the little capacity that it did, it was still disappointing to hear because I was like, eh. Those are my thoughts on Late Night with the Devil. I don't know if any of this made sense. All I can say is that I do enjoy the film. It is one that I will have as part of my October Halloween rotation. Did you enjoy this film? Let me know your thoughts about it. Let me me know what you loved about it, what you hated about it, what are your interpretations of the events that are happening. The next video that I'm going to be posting is probably going to be after Halloween, so I will also wish you all a very happy and safe Halloween. And I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.
At least America can sleep a little easier knowing the devil's not going to pop out of their TV screens.